seemed to be carried over the convolutions of the road in a kind of supernatural silence. On our right, the mountain sifted down into a perfect valley of timeless pine, and everywhere stood frames of slow glass drinking light. An occasional flash of afternoon sunlight on their wind bracing created an illusion of movement. But in fact, the frames were deserted. The rows of windows had been standing on the hillside for years, staring into the valley, and men only cleaned them in the middle of the night, when their human presence would not matter to the thirsty class. They were fascinating, but Selena and I didn't mention the windows. I think we hated each other so much we both were reluctant to sully anything new by drawing it into the nexus of our emotions. The holiday, I had begun to realize, was a stupid idea in the first place. I had thought it would cure everything, but of course it didn't stop Selena from being pregnant, and worse still, it didn't even stop her being angry about being pregnant. Rationalizing our dismay over her condition, we had circulated the usual statements to the effect that we would have liked having children, but later on, at the proper time. Selena's pregnancy had cost us her well-paid job, and with it the new house we had been negotiating, and which was far beyond the reach of my income from poetry. But the real source of our annoyance was that we were face to face with the realization that people who say they want children later always mean they want children never. Our nerves were thrumming with the knowledge that we, who had thought ourselves so unique and had fallen into the same biological trap as every mindless, running creature which ever existed. The road took us along the southern slopes of Ben Karajan until we began to catch glimpses of the gray Atlantic far ahead. I had just cut our speed to absorb the view better when I noticed the sign spiked to a gate post that it said, "Slow glass, quality high, prices low, J.R. Hagen." On an impulse, I stopped the car on the verge, wincing slightly as tough grasses whipped noisily at the bodywork. Why have we stopped? Selena's neat smoke silver head turned in surprise. Look at that sign. Let's go up and see what there is. The stuff might be reasonably priced out here. Selena's voice was pitched high with scorn as she refused, but I was too taken with my idea to listen. I had an illogical conviction that doing something extravagant and crazy would set us right again. "Come on," I said. "The exercise might do us some good. We've been driving too long anyway." She shrugged in a way that hurt me and got out of the car. We walked up a path made of irregular, packed clay steps nosed with short lengths of sapling. The path curved through the trees, which glowed the edge of the hills, and at its end we found a low farmhouse. Beyond the little stone building, tall frames of slow glass gazed out towards the voice-stilling sight of Karajan's ponderous descent towards the waters of Loch Linnahee. Most of the panes were perfectly transparent, but a few were dark, like panels of polished ebony. As we approached the house, through a neat cobbled yard, a tall middle-aged man in ash-colored tweeds rose and waved to us. He had been sitting in the low rebel wall, which bounded the yard, smoking a pipe and staring towards the house. At the front window of the cottage, a young woman in tangerine dress stood with a small boy in her arms, but she turned disinterestedly and moved out of sight as we drew near. "Mr. Hagen," I guessed. "Correct. Come to see some glass, have you? Well, you've come to the right place. Hagen spoke crisply with traces of pure Highland, which sounds so much like Irish to the unaccustomed ear. He had one of those calmly displayed faces one finds on elderly road menders and philosophers. Yes, I said. We're on holiday. We saw your sign. Selena, who usually had a natural fluency with strangers, said nothing. She was looking towards the now empty window with what I thought was a slightly puzzled expression. Up from London, are you? Well, as I said, you've come to the right place, and at the right time, too. My wife and I don't see many people this early in the season. I laughed. Does that mean we'll be able to buy a little glass without mortgaging our home? Look at that now, Hagen said, smiling helplessly. I've thrown away any advantage I might have had in the transaction. Rose, that's my wife. Says I never learn. Still, let's sit down and talk it over. He pointed at the rebel wall, then glanced doubtfully at Selena's immaculate blue skirt. Wait till I fetch a rug from the house. Hagen limped quickly into the cottage, closing the door behind him. Perhaps it wasn't such a marvelous idea to come up here, I whispered to Selena. But you might at least be pleasant to the man. I think I could smell a bargain. Some hope, she said with deliberate coarseness. Surely even you must have noticed that ancient dress his wife was wearing. He won't give away much to strangers. Was that his wife? Of course it was his wife. Well, I said, surprised. Anyway, try to be civil with him. I don't want to be embarrassed. Selena snorted, but she smiled whitely when Hagen reappeared, and I relaxed a little. Strange how a man can love a woman, and yet at the same time pray for her to fall under a train. Hagen spread a tartan blanket over the wall. We sat down, feeling slightly self-conscious at having been translated from our city-oriented lives to a rural tableau. On the distant light of the loch, beyond the watchful flames of slow glass, a slow-moving steamer drew a white line towards the south. The boisterous mountain air seemed to almost to invade our lungs, giving us more oxygen than we required. Some of the glass farmers around here, Hagen began, give strangers such as yourselves a sales talk about how beautiful the autumn is in this part of Argyll. Or it might be the spring. Or the winter. I don't do that. Any fool knows that a place which doesn't look right in summer never looks right. What do you say? I nodded compliantly. I want you to take a good look out towards small Mr. Garland. That's what you're buying if you buy my glass, and it never looks better than it does at this minute. The glass is in perfect phase, none of it less than 10 years thick, and a 4-foot window will cost you £200. 200? Selena was shocked. That's as much as they charge at the Cindo shop in Barn Street. Hagen smiled patiently, then looked closely at me to see if I knew enough about glass to appreciate what he had been saying. His price had been much higher than I'd hoped, but 10 years thick. The cheap glass one found in places like Vistaplex and Planorama stores usually consisted of 1/4 of an inch of ordinary glass, faced with a veneer of slow glass, perhaps only 10 or 12 months thick. You don't understand, darling, I said, already determined to buy. This glass will last 10 years, and it's in phase. Doesn't that mean it only keeps time? Hagen smiled at her again, realizing he had no further necessity to bother with me. Only, you say? Pardon me, Mrs. Garland, but you don't seem to appreciate the miracle, the genuine, honest-to-goodness miracle of engineering precision needed to produce a piece of glass in phase. When I say the glass is 10 years thick, it means it takes light 10 years to pass through it. In fact, each one of those panes is 10 light years thick, more than twice the distance of the nearest star. So a variation in actual thickness of only 1/millionth of an inch would... He stopped talking for a moment and sat quietly looking towards the house.
I turned my head from the view of the look and saw a young woman standing at the window again. Hagen's eyes were filled with a kind of greedy reverence, which made me feel uncomfortable and at the same time convinced me that Selena had been wrong. In my experience, husbands never looked at wives that way, at least not at their own. The girl remained in view for a few seconds, dress glowing warmly, then moved back into the room. Suddenly, I received a distinct, though inexplicable impression she was blind. My feeling was that Selena and I were perhaps blundering through an emotional interplay as violent as our own. "I'm sorry," Mr. Hagen continued. "I thought Rose was going to call me from something. Now, where was I, Mrs. Garland? 10 light years compressed into a quarter of an inch means..." I ceased to listen, partly because I was already sold, partly because I had heard the story of slow glass many times before and never yet understood the principles involved. An acquaintance with scientific training had once tried to be helpful by telling me to visualize a pane of slow glass as a hologram, which did not need coherent light from a laser for the reconstitution of its visual information, and in which every photon of ordinary light passed through a spiral tunnel coiled outside the radius of capture of each atom in the glass. This gem of, to me, incomprehensibility not only told me nothing, it convinced me once again that a mind as non-technical as mine should concern itself less with causes than effects. The most important effect was in the eyes of the average individual was that the light took a long time to pass through a sheet of slow glass. A new piece was always jet black because nothing had yet come through, but one could stand the glass beside, say, a woodland lake until the scene emerged, perhaps a year later. If the glass was then removed and installed in a dismal city flat, the flat would, for that year, appear to overlook the woodland lake. During the year, it wouldn't be merely a very realistic but still picture. The water would ripple in sunlight, silent animals would come to drink, birds would cross the sky, night would follow day, season would follow season, until one day, a year later, the beauty held in the subatomic pipelines would be exhausted, and the familiar gray cityscape would reappear. Apart from its stupendous novelty value, the commercial success of slow glass was founded on the fact that having a screen Tao was the exact emotional equivalent of owning land. The meanest cave dweller could look out on mystery parks, and who is to say they weren't his? A man who really owns tailored gardens and estates doesn't spend his time proving his own ownership by crawling on the ground, feeling, smelling, tasting it. All he receives from the land are warm light patterns with screen towels. These patterns could be taken into coal mines, submarines, prison cells. On several occasions, I have tried to write shorter pieces about the enchanted crystal, but to me, the theme is so ineffably poetic as to be, paradoxically, beyond the reach of poetry, mine at any rate. Besides, the best songs and verse had already been written, with the present inspiration by men who had died long before slow glass was discovered, and I had no hope of equaling. For example, Moore with his "Oft in a stilly night, ere slumber's chain has bound me, fond memory brings me light of other days around me." It took only a few years for slow glass to develop a scientific curiosity to a sizable industry, and much to the astonishment of we poets, those of us who remained convinced that beauty lives through lilies. The trappings of that hidden industry were no different from those of any other. There were good scene towels, which cost a lot of money, and there were inferior scene towels, which cost rather less. But thickness measured in years was an important factor in the cost. But there was also the a question of the actual thickness or phase. Even with the most sophisticated engineering techniques available, thickness control was something of a hit-and-miss affair. A coarse discrepancy could mean that a pane intended to be 5 years thick might be 5.5, so that light which entered in summer emerged in winter. A fine discrepancy could mean that noon sunshine emerged at midnight. These incompatibilities had their peculiar charm. Many night workers, for example, liked having their own private time zones, but in general it cost more to buy sundials, which kept closely in step with real time. Selena still looked unconvinced when Hagen had finished speaking. She shook her head almost imperceptibly, but I knew he had been using the wrong approach. Quite suddenly, the pewter helmet of her hair was disturbed by a cool gust of wind, and a huge, clean, tumbling drops of rain began to spring round us from an almost cloudless sky. "I'll give you a check now," I said abruptly, and saw Selena's green eyes triangulate angrily on my face. "You can arrange delivery." "Aye, delivery's no problem," Hagen said, getting to his feet. "But wouldn't you rather take the glass with you?" "Well, yes, if you don't mind." I was shamed by his readiness to trust my script. "I'll unclip a plane for you. Wait here. It won't take long to slip it into a carrying frame." Hagen limped down the slope towards the serried windows, some of which the view towards Linley was sunny, while others were cloudy and a few pure black. Selena drew the collar of her blouse close at her throat. The least he could have done was invite us inside. There can't be so many fools passing through that he can afford to neglect them. I tried to ignore the insult and concentrated on writing the check. One of the outsized drops broke across my knuckles, splattering the pink paper. "All right," I said. "Let's move in under the eaves till he gets back." "You bitch," I thought, as I felt the whole thing go completely wrong. I just had to be a fool to marry you, a prized fool, a fool's fool. And now that you've trapped part of me inside you, I'll never, ever, never, ever, never, ever get away. Feeling my stomach clench itself painfully, I ran behind Selena to the side of the cottage. Beyond the window, the neat living room with its coal fire was empty, but the child's toys were scattered on the floor. Alphabet blocks and a wheelbarrow the exact color of freshly pared carrots. As I stared in, the boy came running from the other room, began kicking the blocks. He didn't notice me. A few moments later, the young woman entered the room and lifted him, laughing easily and wholeheartedly as she swung the boy under her arm. She came to the window as she had done earlier. I smiled self-consciously, but neither she nor the child responded. My forehead prickled icily. Could they both be blind? I settled away. Selena gave a scream, and I spun towards her. "The rug," she said. "It's getting soaked." She ran across the yard in the rain, snatched the reddish square from the dappling wall, and ran back towards the cottage door. Something heaved convulsively in my subconscious. "Selena," I shouted, "don't open it." But it was too late. She had pushed open the latch wooden door and was standing, hand over mouth, looking into the cottage. I moved close to her and took the frog from her unresisting fingers. As I was closing the door, I let my eyes traverse the cottage's interior, the neat living room which I had just seen the woman and the child it was, in reality. A sickening clutter of shabby furniture, old newspapers, cast-off clothing and smeared dishes. It was damp, stinking, and utterly deserted. The only object I recognized from my view through the window was the little wheelbarrow, paintless and broken. I latched the door firmly and ordered myself to forget what I had just seen. Some men who live alone are good housekeepers. Others just don't know how. Selena's face was white. "I don't understand. I don't understand it." "Slow glass works both ways," I said gently. "Light passes out of a house as well as in." "Do you mean?" "I don't know. It isn't our business. Now steady up. Hagen's coming back with our glass." churning in my stomach was beginning to subside. Hagen came into the yard carrying an oblong plastic-covered frame. I held the check out to him, but he was busy staring at Selena's face. He seemed to know immediately that our uncomprehending fingers had rummaged through his soul. Selena avoided his gaze. She was old and ill-looking, and her eyes stared determinedly towards the nearing horizon. "I'll take the rug from you, Mr. Garland," Hagen finally said. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself over it." "No trouble. Here's the check." "Thank you." He was still looking at Selena with a strange kind of supplication. "It's been a pleasure to do business with you." "The pleasure was mine," I said, with equal senseless formality. I picked up the heavy frame and guided Selena towards the path which led to the road. Just as we reached the head of the now slippery steps, Hagen spoke again. "Mr. Garland." I turned unwillingly. "It wasn't my fault," he said steadily. "A hit-and-run driver got them both down the open road 6 years ago. My boy was only 7 when it happened. I'm entitled to keep something." I nodded wordlessly and moved down the path, holding my wife close to me, treasuring the feel of her arms locked around me. At the bend, I looked back through the rain and saw Hagen sitting with squared shoulders on the wall where we had first seen him. He was looking